Too often we see good parents caught in the crosshairs of CPS, while truly neglectful and even abusive parents seem to get away with it until it's too late for the child. Our next guest tonight is calling on Georgia Governor Brian Kemp to look into how his state is a hotbed for such government corruption, particularly when it comes to separating families with no evidence of abuse or neglect. Here's a clip of his plea.
This video is for Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, and it's not going to be like my usual videos with all the fancy edits and all of that. This is just me talking to you, Brian Kemp, man to man. Brian, you are a father. I know you have 3 daughters. I know they're all adults now, but I want you to think back to when they were babies. Now imagine if one of them was in pain and crying one night, and so you and your wife Marty took her to the hospital, and once they checked her out, she was seized on suspicion of abuse, even though you know that neither one of you had harmed a single hair on her head. And then the next day, police come to your house, arrest you for felony child abuse, and take your other 2 baby girls. Now, they release you on bail, but as a condition of your bond, you're not allowed to live with or even speak with your wife, Marty. Now, you know you didn't abuse your daughter, so you try to get her medical records from the hospital, but for some reason, you have to fight for months to get them from the state. And when you finally get them, you find out why. Those tests and exams that they did say that she has a chronic health condition which explains all of her injuries, and that's when you realize that the Department of Family and Children's Services is trying to hide it.
We'll talk in just one moment as to why those agencies would try to hide something like medical records in order to railroad a parent. But first, I want to read this excerpt from his petitions page. It reads, quote, "At 30%, Georgia has one of the nation's lowest reunification rates for children in foster care. These parents fight in vain to get their children back. DFCS petitions a juvenile court judge to terminate the parental rights of factually innocent parents and ask for their medically fragile children to be placed into the state's foster care system or adopted. And 70% of the time, that's precisely what a juvenile court judge does. For example, the rate is 11% in Camden County. This means the appointed juvenile court judge, who has been on the bench for decades, sides with DFCS almost 90% of the time. The fundamental principle of our criminal legal system is that every person accused of a crime is presumed innocent unless and until their guilt is established beyond a reasonable doubt. However, DFCS operates under the belief that parents are guilty until proven innocent, and these families have suffered unnecessarily at the hands of a broken system." End quote. Joining us now to discuss is Spike Cohen, the founder and president of You Are the Power. Spike, thanks for being here tonight.
It's always great to be on. Thank you, Kara.
Great. So that hypothetical you used in the clip we just showed about the governor isn't just a hypothetical to the Hernandez family that we've spoken about before on the show, is it?
No, it's not. Not to the Hernandez family or to the Timms family or to the Sullivan family or to many, many other families in Georgia. It's actually worse than what that wording said. It says that, they're presumed guilty until they can prove themselves innocent. It's actually worse than that. They're presumed guilty and then not allowed to prove themselves innocent. We have family court judges who are refusing to hear the evidence that shows that there was no abuse and that this is a chronic health condition that these children have. And instead they rely on the testimony of the so-called child abuse pediatrician, who very often doesn't bring any paperwork and just says, yeah, I'm pretty sure it was abuse.
And why the railroading? Why would some of these state agencies be so vested in, listening to one person and then excluding all the exculpatory evidence and not paying it much mind?
That's how they get funding. And that's the problem. The system is set up in such a way that in order to maximize the funding that they get both from the state of Georgia and from the federal government through a title in the Social Security Act, the more times they say that there is abuse, the more money they get. And if that child has a chronic health condition, which they then acknowledge after they've taken it from the parents, first they say it's abuse, and then once they have the child seized, they go, oh, this child has a chronic health condition. They get even more money. And then when they place that child for adoption, they get even more money. And not only do the departments get more money, the actual individuals involved in the system get more money. The child abuse physician, the caseworkers, the court judge, everyone involved is basically being paid off. And at this point, it amounts to a child trafficking operation. They are being paid to take children from innocent families and give them to another family. That's child trafficking.
It is, and do you think it's also a mark against just having a Byzantine, gigantic bureaucratic system where no one really, the buck really doesn't stop anywhere, right? Because, we've all had our experiences, right, with these gigantic, whether they're government entities or they're private entities, they're just gigantic. And you try calling a million people, and to everyone, they go, oh, well, your paper came across my desk, I checked out the details, it looked fine from my little point of view, I rubber stamped it, sent it to the next guy. So then you call the next guy, and it's the same story on and on and on, and no one really takes accountability to look at the case in full, right? They get their little portion of it. They do whatever their little job is. They clock in at 9, they leave by 5. I've had to deal with some of those, government officials myself, and sometimes they aren't too happy. They don't want to do more than they have to do. So they go, well, when it came across my desk, I did my little signature, my little rubber stamping, and I just moved it along. So it's really hard to find that accountability because sometimes it's not just one person that you can talk to and try and deal with. Sometimes it's just a mess of people and everyone has only little pieces of information that maybe their, colleague in another department doesn't have, and then you're trying to connect the dots. And at the same time, you're the one, like you said, you can't even prove yourself innocent because they're saying you have to stay away from your children. They have to be over here. You can't even visit them. And they're putting all these restrictions on what you can and can't do. So do you think that that may play as a role that some of these government agencies, they're just so powerful, but these aren't exactly the people you want to be having all that power in their little hands?
They're way too big. They have way too much authority. And again, they're being incentivized to do the wrong thing. So when there is a caseworker who looks at a case and says, this isn't abuse. This is a problem. I'm going to say that this isn't abuse. They often get fired. We have had resigned and fired DFCS workers who have reached out to us with emails and evidence saying that we were told if you don't maximize the number of children that are being put through this system, that's your problem and you're going to be up for review for it or you may be fired for it. When foster families come forward and say these children that are in our care are crying out for their parents, and I think one of them might actually have a health problem. I don't think they were abused. They get notices saying that their services will no longer be needed. So at a time when these child protective services across the country are complaining that they can't get enough good caseworkers and they can't get enough good foster homes, there's a reason for that. They're actually pushing away the bad ones and favoring the ones who are willing to just be the one who checks off when it's their turn so that everyone gets their money. It is from the top down and the bottom up. It is at this point, I would call it an evil system. It is incentivized to do maximum harm to families in order to traffic children for money.
It is, and again, that's just another strike against having a government that gets so big and so powerful. Because we've seen a similar dynamic play out, as pro-law enforcement as I am willing to admit that there is an issue where sometimes you have prosecutors, sometimes you have law enforcement officers who really think that the suspect that they have in their clutches is the guy. And then they, in their minds, even if they're not sometimes fully intentionally, but not always, sometimes they just see the evidence, and even if it doesn't match the guy that they think it is, they'll make it in their mind, they'll stretch everything to make it seem like it's that guy, and then railroad that guy in court, and then maybe years later it's proved by DNA that it was actually never that guy. He was innocent the entire time. So there could also be a similar thing here with some of these bureaucrats who, a lot of power in their heads, and they do see some bad parents, and so they maybe just have that preset of all these parents are bad, and so anything that you say as the parent when you're the good parent trying to defend yourself and your children, they just write you off as, see another one of these parents. You're just like all the rest, and it doesn't matter how much evidence you show them because those blinders are just on so tight, and that's just a human nature aspect that happens, and yet government just brings the worst of that out in people, and there's really no checks and balances on that. It leaves so many people in a lurch. But perhaps some defenders of the system, they might try and say, well, having lower reunification rates, that maybe that saves more children's lives, but is that true at all? Does Georgia have a better, higher rate, of keeping children safe from abuse and neglect than other states? Or is that maybe just something that, proponents might try and say to cover their tracks on this?
Absolutely not. The state of Georgia lost 2,000 children in the last 4 years. 2,000 children who were under foster care or in the system awaiting an adoptive family. We don't know where they are. They don't know where they are. Some of them probably graduated out and are no longer minors, but they still should know where they were because they were once teenagers or adolescents who were living in what could have been potentially loving families that they were taken from. What we've also seen is that the more abusive a system is, the less likely it is to actually go after actual abusers, because that's kind of hard. Actual abusers they know how to skirt the system. They know how to play the system. They know how to cover their tracks and try to hide the evidence. They know not to talk to the investigators when they come. But innocent parents who did nothing wrong, yeah, when the police come, they're happy to talk about it because they know they didn't do anything wrong. There's no tracks to cover because they didn't do anything wrong. They're not trying to obfuscate the system because they didn't even know the system was like this. They literally just took their kid who was complaining of being in pain or crying or had swelling and took them to a children's hospital and haven't seen them since. So the more abusive a system like this is, the less likely they are to actually go after abusers, because at this point they're acting like a predator, and predators tend to go after the easiest prey.
No, that is such a smart point. So before I let you go tonight, Spike, where can viewers who feel fired up about this too, where can they go and help you in this quest?
So two things you can do. If you go to youarethepower.net, right there, /GA for Georgia. All of the information is there. We have the governor's email address. We have a wording template that you can use when you email him and call for him to meet with us, because that's what we're pushing for the governor to meet with us and these families to talk about the nightmare they're being put through, the problems that are causing it, and how this can be fixed, not just in Georgia, but create a template for reform that can be used in the other 49 states as well. So if you want to help us, go to youarethepower.net /Georgia, and you can also go on Brian Kemp's social media, on every single one of his posts, and join me in calling for him to meet with us and end this nightmare for these families for good.
Well, Spike, I really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Kara.